Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the primary arms GLX 2.5 to 10. This one here has the ACSS Griffin mill reticle. But before we get into the video, if you do want to help me out personally, you can, of course, like, share, and subscribe, as that is free and does help me out quite a bit. Also, go ahead and comment your favorite medium power optic in the comments down below. Now, on top of that, there's also Subscribestar, which is just a pro to a Patreon, and there's also my website, which again, in theory, has something in stock available for purchase. Now, getting into full disclosure on the primary arms GLX 2.5 to 10, they sent this optic as well as the mount, which we will talk about towards the end of the video. So they sent this entire package out to me for free to review. On top of that, I am also a dealer for primary arms optics. I have reviewed a lot of their stuff in the past. I buy a lot of stuff from them, and they've sent me out some stuff as well. So just, again, keep that in mind throughout this video. Now, getting into some basics about the optic itself, this is a 30mm main tube. It is a one-piece 30mm main tube made out of 6061 T6 aluminum, which is fairly industry standard. In terms of size and weight, it's just over 12 inches long, I think 12.5 inches long, and about 22 ounces. Now, in terms of size and weight, that's not really that bad. 22 ounces is not particularly heavy for a 10x top-end magnification. However, it's also not a particularly light optic either, so again, just keep that in mind. Now, in terms of other exterior features, we of course have our magnification ring, which is very nicely knurled and includes this little fin here. Now, the fin itself is removable, and you can actually put it in a couple different locations on the throw lever itself or on the magnification ring itself. On top of that, I believe they make aftermarket ones, so if you wanted a little bit of a taller one for a little bit more of a quick throw style, you could definitely do that. On top of that, the throw itself is very smooth, has a good amount of force, a good amount of resistance, even without a enhanced throw lever or what have you. And on top of that, the throw is only about 120 degrees, meaning that it's a pretty fast flip from 2.5 to 10, even without an extended throw lever. Now, on the back of the optic, we of course have our diopter for adjusting the reticle to your eyes, which is important, especially when we get into a little bit higher magnification scopes, to make sure that that reticle is as good as it can be for you. Now, on the side of the optic here, we have our parallax adjustment, which goes, I believe, all the way from 25 yards out to infinity. 25 yards is not necessarily the shortest parallax. You can definitely get scopes that go down to like 15 or 10 yards. However, for this intended purpose, that is perfectly fine. Now, of course, we also have our illumination dial, which goes from 0 to 11 with an offsetting in between, has very nice tactile clicks. Now, unfortunately, on max brightness, it's not particularly bright. It's not really even daylight visible. It might be tinted just a little bit, but again, for darker situations, low light, dusk, that sort of thing, it will be visible and again useful in those situations. Now, importantly, it does not light up the grid or any of the exterior auto ranging features. It only lights up the center chevron, and again, it's not particularly bright. Now, getting into the turrets on the GLX 2.5 to 10, this is of course the Griffin mill reticle, so these are in 0.1 mil increments. The clicks themselves are very tactile, they're very audible, they're very precise, there's very little movement whatsoever, and again, they feel very good. On top of that, both the windage and the elevation have zero stops, or at least a kind of zero locking feature. So for instance, right now, the zero stop is enabled. I have a 0.5 mil down, or like 0.4 of a mil down that I can go, and then to unlock it so I can actually dial up, you simply push in the button, and of course you are good to go. Now, having that additional bit of security when it comes to locking out your windage and elevation is very nice, as these are very large, kind of extended turrets, if you will. And so, as we'll get into later on, they can be fairly easy to bump and not realize it. So, of course, the zero stop can be adjusted. So if you ever need to, you're shooting during the dark, whatnot, you want to go back to zero, you of course go all the way back. You get a 0.5 mil under, and then of course the turret is locked in place. To unlock, push the button, and then you can dial to your heart's content. Now, as I've used this optic, I've used it on a bunch of different guns. I used it on a 16-inch AR, I've used it on a 16-inch 308, I believe an 18-inch 6.5 Creedmoor, and most of the time has been on this Savage Axis 2 Precision. This is a 5.56 or a 2.23 rifle that is fairly precise and works great out to about 700 yards, which is kind of the optimal range for this scope. Now, getting into the GLX line of optics from Primary Arms, this is kind of their mid-range scope, if you will. I believe the retail price is about $750. Obviously, occasionally that goes on sale a little bit less than that, but these are not inexpensive scopes, and they're also not the top end. So their SLX is, of course, the cheaper lineup. GLX is their middle of the road lineup, and then their Platinum is the top end that Primary Arms makes. Now, these are made in the Philippines, and in terms of their glass qualities and construction, does actually seem to be a step above what you get from Chinese optics. The glass quality, light transmission, all of that is very good. If we get into the specifics of eye box and eye relief, on the website, they claim about 2.7 to 2.8 inches of eye relief, which sounds really short. However, at lower magnifications, you really have about 4 inches of eye relief, and then it tightens up to about 3 inches on the top end. So at 10x magnification, I can get full eye relief from back here. And then, of course, when you dial it back to 2.5 or anywhere in between, you have a much, much more forgiving eye relief and eye box. Now, in terms of field of view on the optic, it is what I would consider to be okay. It's nothing special, but it is, again, just fine. So I believe you have about 35 feet on the low end, and then it goes all the way to 10 feet on the high end. So again, equivalent to about 100 feet field of view on an LPVO at 1x. So again, not necessarily great, but definitely usable. So probably the two most important things when selecting a scope for any application are going to be its magnification range, which is going to determine its optimal use case, if you will, the distance where it will perform the best at. Now, you can always take a 10x out to 1,000 yards, 1,500 yards if you really wanted to, and you can always take a 7 to 35 at 15 yards. However, again, those really aren't going to be the optimal distances for either of those magnifications. For me personally, a 2.5 to 10 is going to be really good out to about 6 to 700 yards, and then if I'm going beyond 700 yards, I'd probably rather have some more magnification to be a little bit more refined, a little bit more precise. You can, again, use it at extended distances, but it is, of course, just going to be a little bit suboptimal. And the second half of that is, of course, going to be the reticle. So how well does that reticle allow you to perform within the magnification level's optimum distance? Now, 2.5 to 10 for me personally, again, most of the time on this scope, I was using it at 10x magnification. This is a first focal plane optic, so you can, of course, use it at any magnification level and still use your mill grid, your auto ranging features, everything that the reticle has to offer. Now, most of the time when I was shooting with this optic, I was shooting at 400 yards and beyond, 4, 5, 6, and 700 yards. Those were the most often distances that I was using this optic. However, I did use it a little bit inside of like 75, 100 yards on 2.5 power, just kind of seeing how it performed in a more close range environment. Usually when I had this on like the AR-10 or some of the other guns, I would run it with an offset red dot. So of course you kind of have that mixed range capability. Now for me, where I live in Western Washington, where it is quite wooded, a 2.5 to 10 works perfectly, as getting sight lines of beyond 1,000 yards can be quite difficult, and most of the time, most places that I go top out at 5, 6, 700 yards or so. So again, that 2.5 to 10 for me is very optimal in the area that I live and how I shoot. Now, if we're talking about the reticle, getting into the ACSS Griffin mill reticle, it does have a lot of the standard features that you're going to find on a lot of other ACSS reticles. So it is based off of the center chevron, which in this case I am going to complain about a little bit later on. But again, we do have a center chevron, which provides us a very fine, refined point of aim using the tip for zeroing, or if you are going to dial, because again, you do have very nice turrets on here, so sometimes you will be dialing. And then below that, we have our 1x1 mil grid. Now, a 1x1 mil grid is not terribly precise when you're shooting at like medium-sized targets at, again, 5, 6, and 700 yards. And that is going to be one of my minor complaints about this optic, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Some of the other features that we have is we have, of course, auto-ranging brackets on either side. So you have your width and your height auto ranging out to, I believe, 800 yards or so. So basically you just line up your target either horizontally or vertically within those brackets, and it'll tell you, again, approximately how far away they are. Now, on either side of the center chevron, we also have our dots for moving targets. And then, of course, we also have the super oversized horseshoe for kind of snap acquisition or up close CQB style. If you really wanted to use it inside of like 20 to 30 yards, you can basically just throw that big horseshoe on a target, pull the trigger, and you should be getting an acceptable hit. Now, getting into the two very specific complaints that I have with this reticle. Now, keep in mind that this is in conjunction with the distances that I'm shooting, the targets that I am shooting at, this rifle, ammunition, and of course the 2.5 to 10. So, my first complaint, we'll start with the mill grid, is while the mill grid is very nice, very usable, it's not quite precise enough at extended distances or kind of intermediate distances, if you will, 5, 6, and 700 yards on reduced size targets. While it is very nice, I did often find myself having to bracket in between 4 dots. So again, it is just a 1 by 1 mil grid. So again, at those extended distances, a lot of times with wind and drop and whatnot, I was bracketing a target somewhere in the center of 4 mil dots, because again, it is a 1 by 1 mil grid. And then I would kind of have to reference off of the target without really having a good fine point of aim. Now, it was still very usable, and I was able to get shots and impacts at those distances very consistently. However, I do wish that the grid was a little bit more precise. Now, the second complaint that I have is very similar to the first one, and it has to do with the center chevron. Now, it should be noted that I was using this scope in both ways, both having the turrets completely zeroed out and using the mil grid for everything, and then also using the center chevron and dialing for both elevation and windage. Now, the problem that I have with the center chevron is that it is too big, in my personal opinion. Again, for those medium-sized targets out to about 500, 600, 700 yards, it ends up covering not only half or more of the targets, again, when you're using that tip for a fine, refined point of aim, but it also tends to cover up low left of the target and low right of the target, which can be a problem, of course, if you're trying to account for a decent amount of wind, as I was, meaning if you're just missing just to the left or just to the right of the target, you're really not going to be able to tell, because again, that chevron covers up quite a bit of the target and the surrounding area, again, at these more extended 600, 700 yards. Now, on top of that, if you're holding just a little bit high, you don't want to dial that extra 0.1, 0.2 mils, well, now you're covering up almost the entire target with that chevron. Now, I like the chevron, I like the mil grid, I just wish that they were a little bit more precise. Now, Primary Arms actually has a optic and a reticle that does all of those things, but in a much more precise way. So this is their SLX 4 to 14, which I know is a little bit higher of a magnification level, but this is the ACSS R Grid 2B reticle or something like that. This uses a very similar looking reticle, somewhat, but it has a much thinner, much more refined point of aim in the center chevron, so it's much thinner, covers up much less of the target, which is what I would like to see in the Griffin mil reticle as well, specifically in this 2.5 to 10. And on top of that, the grid portion in this optic is 0.5 mil by 0.5 mil, which is much more precise than what you're getting in the GLX 2.5 to 10. Now, on top of that, I also have on pre-order their SLX 1 to 10, which is supposedly coming in late September or so. That optic uses kind of a hybrid of the two in their 10S Griffin mil reticle, I think is what they call it. So that has kind of the center chevron portion of this optic, where it is very fine, very precise, with a smaller horseshoe, and then it has the 1 by 1 mil grid. Even that would be preferable to having the coarse chevron and the 1 by 1 mil grid. Now, I know that this is, again, a slightly lower magnification level than the 4 to 14, but I still think it is doable to get a more precise grid in the reticle itself, which would, again, help out at those extended distances. For instance, here is a 1 to 8 model. This is a Vector Constantine 1 to 8, completely different brand, I know, but this one here also has a mil grid style reticle. Now, this reticle in the 1 to 8 has a 1 mil increment for the drop, but a 0.5 mil increment for the windage, meaning that with this optic, I was actually taking it out as the exact same day as the 2.5 to 10, shooting in the exact same conditions, basically. Obviously, a much shorter barrel length, same ammunition though. And with the much more precise windage on it, because of course I have 0.5 mil increments versus 1 mil increments, it was much easier to have a very fine point of aim using the mil grid within the reticle, even though it's a lower magnification level. And again, you're experiencing more drop and more wind on a much shorter barrel, much lower velocity, that sort of thing. It was actually easier to do the windage on that just because I had a more precise hold. So again, instead of trying to bracket a target at like 700 yards between that 1 mil space, I have a much more definite point of aim that I can use to just put that exactly where I want it, versus again having to do a little bit of guesswork on the Griffin mil. Those complaints, well, again, that is what I would like to see in this 2.5 to 10. I would like to see it be a little bit more precise in terms of its reticle, both with the center chevron and the grid, even if it just went to 0.5 mil increments in the windage and kept the 1 mil increments in the drop. Personally, that would be perfectly fine for me, but again, I would like to see it a little bit more precise, especially for those kind of mid-range distances where the scope honestly excels at. It is very very good at 4, 5, 6, and 700 yards. But again, I would like a little bit more help personally at those extended distances at, again, smaller-ish targets. And again, I'd use this optic in both ways, both dialing using the very nice turrets and using the center chevron, and zeroing out the turrets and using the mill grid. And I am being very nitpicky here. Again, this optic was very easy to get out to 4, 5, 6, and 700 yards. I had very little issues being consistent at those distances. I'm just asking for just a little bit more precision, which would help me out personally, again, at those more extended distances on smaller targets. Now, getting into the durability of the optic, if you will. Most of our optics go through a double drop test, and this one here was no different. Now, for the drop test on this, I didn't drop it on an AR-500 steel target. Basically, I did a control group at 500 yards. I did 3 rounds at 500 yards, which were all perfect hits, no problems there. And then I wanted to go ahead and do a double drop test to see if the optic could be dropped, experience a sharp impact. Just simulating a sharp impact is basically all drops are doing. And then will it be able to go right back out to 500 yards? So again, I did a double drop test on the optic, one on the top of the optic, one on the side of the optic, on kind of dirt, rocks, and wood chips, if you will. So it's not a terribly hard impact, though this is a very heavy gun. I believe the gun naked is like 11, 12 pounds, something like that. So it's a fairly heavy gun, not including the optic setup as well, of course. And see if I could go right back out to 500 yards. Now, the problem at that point was that I was dialing with the turrets, so they were not locked out. At the time, I did not think that they had shifted, but it actually did shift up a half mil. I took the first shot and was like, oh, hey, it's a half mil high at 500 yards. Dial it back down and go right back to work. Turret didn't move. We'll do one on the side of the optic. Straight above the target. Oh, nope, it did move the turret. My bad. It moved it from 9 to 9.5. I haven't re-zeroed these turrets, by the way. Okay, so it did move the turret. It moved it from 9 to 9.5, so that first shot was super high. Now, personally, if you are dialing using the actual turrets themselves, and of course they're not locked out, and you're walking around, hiking through woods, hunting with it, whatnot, just keep in mind where your turrets actually are, because they are very nice, very large, very tactile. However, they can be prone to bumping or shifting around a little bit. Of course, if you drop your optic, you should definitely check your turrets anyways. So again, personally, I am very happy with the durability of the scope, its ability to retain zero, especially in conjunction with this mount. Now, this mount is, again, very expensive. I believe these retail for about $250. So overall, this optic and mount combination is around $1,000. But again, I am very happy with its performance. Now, I know that I have some minor complaints with the reticle. However, the reticle is still, for me personally, again, in that sort of 5, 6, 700 yard envelope. It's still a 9 out of 10. It's just, it could be a little bit more precise and would help you a little bit more at, again, those further distances within its optimal window. Now, that being said, do I think that this is a good option for kind of those intermediate distances? Well, no. I actually think it's an excellent option for those intermediate distances if you're in that $700, $800 price tag. This is not a budget scope. You can get a similar scope even from Primary Arms. Does not have anywhere near the features or glass quality like the 4-14 for about $300. But this is again going to be a step up in terms of features, turrets, locking turrets. You have better glass quality. The reticle, while it is very, very good, not quite perfect, at least in my personal opinion, you get a lot of great features in here. It just happens to command a higher price tag, though again, it does appear that the build quality, durability, longevity, again, the glass quality is pretty uncontestably better than the lower end SLX lineup. But again, that's really going to be up to you guys, whether you think the upgraded features, the enhanced build quality, durability, light transmission, glass quality, those sorts of things are worth the jump in price from something like the SLX line to the GLX line, or of course other competitors in that same sort of price category. Again, these aren't cheap or budget scopes, certainly not in my personal opinion. Now, if you're somebody who buys ZCOs, then this is definitely a more budget scope, and some people do claim that these are kind of like good budget scopes, that sort of thing. For me personally, it is a very rare day when I drop $800 on a scope, so I do not consider this budget. I consider this definitely a mid-tier, not top end, of course, because top end goes up to thousands and thousands of dollars for scope, but definitely kind of a mid-level optic that does its job, again, inside of its optimal window, very, very well. Nearly perfectly, not quite perfectly, but it does its job very well. So, at the end of the day, I do think the GLX 2.5 to 10 with the Griffin mill reticle is a very good option if you're looking for something in that 2.5 to 10 magnification range. Of course, if you're looking for higher or lower magnifications, then you're going to be looking at different scopes anyways. They do have basically the exact same feature set in a 4 to 16, which is definitely going to stretch out that distance for you a little bit more, add on a little bit to the top end, if you will. But again, for that 2.5 to 10 inside of 700 yards, it's going to perform very, very well. Now, talking about the mount for just a moment, because they did send this out, so I should talk about it, of course. It is a very high quality mount. I believe it uses grade 12.9 material for the cross bolts and for the rings as well, so they are very high quality. It has some very nice finish on them as well. The material choice is very nice. It's aesthetic. It's fairly lightweight. It's very strong. However, it's $250, which I do consider to be overpriced for what it is. Now, you will say that there are a plethora of other scope mount companies out there selling very similar featured scopes for around the same price, therefore the price is justified. However, again, for me personally, that is what I would consider to be overpriced, as you can get very exceptional scope mounts from companies like Warren and others for the low $100 price point that have a very similar set of features and durability. Maybe they're an ounce or two heavier, but again, less than half the cost. So for instance, this Warren here, this is the Ramp 30, which of course comes with an integrated 30 millimeter or 30-degree offset or whatever they call it. And you also have steel inserts on the ring, so good luck stripping those guys out. Again, I've used Warren mounts for a long time. They're about 100, 120 bucks. Usually you can get them a little cheaper on sale sometimes. I do think that for a basic 30 millimeter mount, 250 bucks is a big price tag, and just because there are other companies out there that are also overcharging for their scope mounts doesn't mean that you need to buy one, even if it is a very nice mount, which again, it is a very nice mount. It held zero very well, even during the drop test. I don't have any complaints about the mount itself. The construction is very high quality. It's just a little too expensive. So with all that out of the way, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you guys think of the GLX 2.5 to 10 or any other sort of mid-power optic in the comments down below. Tune in next week when we drop test a baby. And with all of that out of the way, guys, I will see you in the next one. Peace off.